Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 28th of July of 2026. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And before we start, once again, a quick announcement. I'm going on vacation from July 29th to August 10, and I would not be able to make videos during this time. So let's continue, and let's continue once again with Zelensky, who came today to the United States of America, where he had already a meeting with the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, and as of the moment when I started making this video, we didn't receive anything about results of this conversation. But one thing is clear, that right before this meeting happened, US senators agree on bill with hellish sanctions against Russia and Iran. A group of senators from both parties have agreed on a bill that would allow the US president to impose additional restrictions against the largest buyers of Russian energy resources as well as against Iran. A procedural vote on the initiative is scheduled for the end of Tuesday, but once again, by the moment I started making this video, the Senate of the United States of America had already voted for this situation, which means that now the President of the United States of America has the possibility to impose hellish sanctions on Russia. But most likely these sanctions won't stop the Russians, because it seems that the Russians realize that they are very close to a turning point of the conflict. Now let's discuss this turning point and let's talk about the situation on the ground. And first we're going to talk about the main direction, and we're talking about the territory between the cities of Dobropillia and Druzhkivka, because it seems that the most important things are happening right now, right exactly in this area. During the previous probably 10 days, the Russians have improved their position significantly in this area, and the Russians continue advancing. So let's discuss everything in details, and first let's talk about the Dobropillia direction, where the map once again has been adjusted. And these are the changes just between two dates, between the 27th and the 28th of July of 2026. As you can see, the Russians continue tightening the noose around positions of the armed forces of Ukraine between the villages of Sergeyevka, Shilivka, Guleva, Vadyanska, Svetlaya, Chernigovka, and the city of Dobropillia itself. And of course, just comparing two dates is not enough to understand the crisis that the Ukrainians see right now, face right now, because when talking about the changes, let's say since the 20th of April of 2026, we'll see much more changes. So for example, this is the end of the 21st, this is the end of the 22nd, this is the end of the 23rd of July of 2026, and this is the end of the 26th of July, this is the end of the 27th, and this is already the end of the 28th of July of 2026. And the thing is that right now we understand that the territory between the cities of Dobropillia and Druzhkivka is the main direction of the Russian offensive operation. The Russians finished regrouping, as we can see, because the battle for the cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd ended in December of 2025, so almost 8 months ago, 7 months ago, the Russians finished the battle for this territory, and during these previous 7 months, the Russians were improving their positions, the Russians were bringing additional forces, the Russians were bringing equipment, the Russians were building headquarters, underground facilities, different fortification territories. The Russians were preparing themselves before the beginning of the major Dobropillia battle. Now, according to these changes, we can say that these preparations have ended and the Russians began advancing. As of the end of the 28th of July of 2026, the Russians, we see, semi-encircled the settlement of Sergeyevka from the south and from the north. The Russians continue advancing in the direction of the settlement of Krivorozhe. The Russians managed to break through Ukraine's defenses through the villages to the south of the settlement of Dobropillia, and now we see that the Russians control probably more than 50% of the city of Dobropillia itself. And the most important thing, and this is a very important situation, the Russians chose not to fight for the city itself, trying to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this territory and wasting resources, so important resources for Russians, like manpower, like many other different things connected with the Russian offensive capabilities. The Russians decided to block the Ukrainians through the western parts of the city of Dobropillia, to dig in deeper through the eastern parts of the settlement, and now the Russians, when finished securing the western flank, began advancing advancing in the northeastern direction along the T040514 road with the purpose to attack the city of Kramatorsk from behind. So this is a very important situation. Of course, the Russians will finish the battle for the city of Dobropillia sooner or later, but the Russians are not going to hurry up with this operation. They have enough of time. They control the northern entrance or exit from the city of Dobropillia. The Russians once again improved the central flank or the western flank of their positions in this area, and now the Russians have enough of time to continue advancing further. At the same time, the Ukrainians still need to keep additional forces through the western parts of the city of Dobropillia if they want to hold these positions, but it doesn't matter for Russians. They will finish the battle for this territory, and it doesn't matter how many days or months it will take. The most important is that the Russians have access to the T0514 road, and now the Russians are able to advance further in the northern direction, and in the most northwestern parts of the Donetsk region. Now let's move further and let's talk about the city of Druzhkivka, where the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly once again. Just yesterday, pro-Russian sources reported that the settlement of Tarskoye was captured by Russians. This information was confirmed both by pro-Russian sources, by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, by different reports published by different sources, and today this information was once again confirmed by this video where we can see at least three flags raised by Russians through different parts of the settlement, and this video confirms Russian control over the settlement of Tarskoye. And today the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the group of forces south confirmed that the Russians managed to improve their positions once again through this territory and to take under complete control the village of Krasny Kut. This is a very important village because the village of Krasny Kut is located basically on the Ukraine side of the river of Kazyony Tarets, which means that now the Russians are able to continue advancing along both sides of the river through the villages of Taretsky, Petrivka and Raiskaya, and along the northern bank of the river of Kazyony Tarets through the villages of Novogrigorovka and further Raiskaya, and the village of Raiskaya is already the beginning of the southwestern parts of the Druzhkivka agglomeration. So this is not something like another offensive operation from the Russian side. This is something like a breakthrough between the cities of Dobropillia and Druzhkivka, and we see that the Russians are not going to stop. The Russians continue advancing between these two defensive lines, and as you can see, the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Syrsky, left his position right before this offensive operation started. It seems that he knew a week ago that something like this would happen, and that's most likely a week ago he didn't have chances to stabilize the situation. Now let's wait and see what kind of actions the current commander-in-chief Drapat is going to do with this situation, but obviously he is limited. He is limited, first of all, in time and resources. Now let's move further. At the same time, the Russians accelerate their offensive operation to the east of Kramatorsk and to the east of Slaviansk. And these are the changes on the ground. The Russians continue shortening the distances between the Russian positions and the agglomeration itself. And currently the distances between edge positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and, let's say, the city of Kramatorsk itself is already less than 6 kilometers. The distances between the edge positions of Russia and the city of Nikolaevka itself is already zero, because the Russians have answered the settlement from the east, and now the fightings and the clashes are taking place through the residential area, which means that within a month, most likely Nikolaevka would be taken by Russians as of the end of the 28th of July of 2026. There is just one direction from the Russian side where the Russians most likely are far behind the schedule, and we are talking about the Liman direction, because months ago the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, Gerasimov, stated that there were just 143 buildings out of 11,000 buildings left before the Russians finished the battle for the city. A month has passed since those statements, and we see that the Russians still haven't managed to finish the battle for this territory. And the reason of this situation that the Ukrainians right now are trying to counterattack to the north of the city of Liman, trying to force the Russians Russians to stop their offensive operation and try not to allow the Russians to finish the semi-encirclement of the entire Slaviansk-Druzhkivka agglomeration. Very difficult to say whether this counter-offensive operation is able to change the picture, to change the entire situation with this breakthrough through the southern and the southwestern parts of the Druzhkivka agglomeration. Very difficult to say, but one thing is clear due to the fact that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians published anything about the situation with Liman. We believe that the Ukrainians most likely haven't managed to achieve their goals of this counter-offensive operation, but at the same time we see that the Russians neither managed to improve their positions significantly through this area, but the Russians most likely managed to save control over their positions, which means that sooner or later the Ukrainians would exhaust completely, because to support the counter-offensive operation through the northern parts or through the northern direction of the city of Liman, you need to have these Izum-Oskol logistic line, stable logistic line for these purposes, and we know that the Russians have complete control over these territories with drones, artillery, and many other different means of fire. So this is the situation in this area. The major battle has already begun. Most likely the Russians would try to improve their positions as much as possible before the beginning of the parliament elections on the territory of Russia, and these advantages, this situation, the president of Russia most likely would use for his party for the election campaign. Now let's move further and let's talk about the northern directions. During the previous 24 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded also through this territory, and these are the changes between just two dates, 27th and 28th of July of 2026. The Russians improved their positions significantly around the settlement of Bely Kolodets. We believe that in a week the Russians will report complete control over the territory, and the Russians continue advancing through the most northeastern parts of the settlement with the purpose to finish the battle for this part of Kharkiv region, and this will allow the Russians to continue offensive operation further in the southern direction to attack the settlement of Veliki Burluk. There are very big changes, as you can see, and we see that the group of forces north continue advancing.
Wieso Steuer mit Nachspielzeit?
Boah, das Spiel gestern war so spannend, dass ich die Steuerfrist verpasst habe.
Echt eine Steuer doch?
As for the most northern parts of the Sumy region, during the previous 24 hours, the changes were recorded through the settlement of Magritsa, and these are the changes on the ground. As you can see, the Russians during the previous 24 hours improved their position significantly. Currently, the Russians control up to 40% of the settlement of Magritsa, and the Russians continue advancing. This is a very important offensive operation because the settlement of Magritsa is the last settlement before the beginning of the this big Sumy forest, and if Russians answer this big Sumy forest, then the situation would change significantly without any chances for the Ukrainian side to restore the previous status, because using this big forest, the Russians first of all would be completely protected against Ukrainian drones, and from these positions the Russians would continue offensive operation towards the city of Sumy itself, and the distances to the city of Sumy right now is already less than 11 kilometers. So the Russians are very close to the city of Sumy, and the Russians have already established complete FPV drone control over the city. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of videos how the Russians were freely flying over the city of Sumy, attacking gas stations, warehouses, ammo depots, logistics, and so on. And as we can see, the Ukrainians are not able to do anything with this situation. So the city of Sumy, the days of the current situation of the city of Sumy are numbered, most likely in coming days, in coming week, probably before the beginning of autumn of 2026, the Ukrainian authorities would be forced to announce a mandatory evacuation. As for the most northern parts of the Sumy region, here we have changes as well. The clashes continue around the settlement of Ulanovo. The Russians are also finishing the battle for this territory. As for the Zaporozhye direction, during the previous 24 hours, no changes were recorded through this territory, but we know for sure that both the Russians and the Ukrainians attack each other. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are trying to do everything they can with the purpose not to allow the situation like in Sumy to happen with the siege of Zaporozhye. The Ukrainians can't announce total evacuation of the siege of Zaporozhye because this is going to be immediate victory for Russians and a significant problem for the armed forces of Ukraine. Meanwhile, both the Russians and the Ukrainians continue attacking each other with dozens of missiles and hundreds of drones, but the Russians still haven't carried out their massive attack, and we believe that in coming 48 hours we'll see a mega strike from the Russian side. And that's it for today. The Military Summary channel reminds we can